Okay, today's video is about censorship. My sixth video, which 35 minutes of it was all about finance and financial policies with respect to our government. I said two words that had it banned. Even upon review, the dum-dums over at YouTube simply don't understand basic concepts. So today's video is going to be about censorship, because the idea that a private corporation through its terms of service can do anything it wants is inconsistent with law, and it's certainly violative of public policy. All right, the policies that have come out over the last 2 years by not just our government but the governments around the world show not just Americans but most everybody are nothing but gullible group thinkers, right? You people lack critical thinking skills. The greatest majority of people lack critical thinking skills, and they're gullible group thinkers. It's really pathetic to see that everybody just falls in line with everything, all right? Now this is moving towards, the arguments will come at first and then the law will come second, all right? The other thing that's been shown is that people are mentally ill. The greatest majority of people are mentally ill. They're detached from reality, and they exhibit mass psychosis. All right. Look at what everybody has done. They've fallen in line. They've not asked any questions. There's actually a guy named Wilhelm Reich wrote a book called The Psychology of Mass Fascism. And there's another book by Eric Hoffer called The True Believer. Now, The True Believer it's an itty bitty teeny weeny little book. The copy that I had years ago, it's a bluish green in color. It's only about this big, and it's thin, relatively thin. You might be able to find it online. And it's a book that everybody should read. It's called The True Believer by Eric Hoffer. All right. The other thing that should be noticed is that the greatest majority of people have no tolerance for rational discourse. All right. I get into it with people all the time because I'm a fact-based individual. I'm a scientific materialist. I'll flip my idea, my opinion based on factual evidence in a heartbeat. If someone give me a foundation, a reasonable foundation for their conclusions that contravene my belief systems, I'll flip my belief systems in a heartbeat if I'm given facts and evidence to be able to support a different position. Absolutely. But Americans in particular, because I don't follow what goes on in Russia and third world countries and so on, but in the United States it's obvious that there's very little tolerance for rational discourse, mostly because people are exhibiting mental illness, they're detached from reality, they have mass psychosis and so on. So the other thing is and I find this among children, is that we simply can't withstand peer pressure. You would think that as intelligent, well, relatively intelligent adults, that if the group says to do one thing and your brain says, yeah, that's nonsense, because you're just, it's like religion, all right? People believe in fill-in-the-blank religion. It can be any, it can Scientology, the nonsense of Scientology, the balderdash of Scientology. Mormonism, it can be any fabricated belief system, and you will have millions and millions of adherents to these philosophies, none of which are supported by repeatable, verifiable, falsifiable, and testable evidence. It's all over the world. So this goes to show that the greatest majority of people cannot withstand peer pressure. They're group thinkers. They're sheep. In fact, we have a term for it. It's called sheeple. Right? The greatest majority of people just read headlines. They look at biased news sources. It's called cognitive dissonance, where what happens is that you can have two competing ideas in your head at the same time. Right? Now, from a rational perspective, you can sit down and say, well, all religion is nonsense, which is one idea, and then you can say, well, the earth is young earth creationism and so on. It's very difficult, on the other hand, to be able to say that I believe in religion and that I'm a geologist, and the geologist knows that the earth is billions of years old. All right, cognitive dissonance takes over, and it's very, very difficult to be able to reconcile a belief system when you have mountains of evidence to be able to support a scientific conclusion, and then you have no evidence to be able to discount it. All right, the other thing is that I see this all the time. The people are virtue signalers. All right, they're always either talking, dressing, whatever it is that they've got on their face or otherwise. It's virtue signaling. I mean, if you look at the travel restrictions around the world, other than maybe in the third world, all of Europe is completely open with no restrictions whatsoever. But that yet there are still a lot of people out there running around. Well, it's virtue signaling is what it really boils down to. Sadly, my conclusion is, from watching all of this, it goes back to what another video of mine said, where I was talking about being a ballroom dancer, and I was always busting the balls of these old Germans at the Edelweiss Club about how they could be stupid enough to fall for Nazi propaganda. And they were just simply saying, well, we're just doing what we're told. And like I said, in my hubris in my youth, I thought to myself, or said otherwise, that Americans would never fall for this nonsense. Well, the truth be told is that you're all a bunch of closet authoritarians. The greatest majority of people out there are weak-minded, and they want government to tell them every little aspect of their lives. They don't want freedom, because freedom costs mental energy and physical energy, and they just want the government to be able to control every aspect of their lives. And more importantly, they want government to control the aspects of everybody else's lives. Right? It's a fallacy to think that human policies can control everything or nothing. I mean, you can't prevent adversity in this world. It's just absolutely ridiculous to think that the morons that are sitting up in Congress or Colorado General Assembly, California General Assembly, New York, and so on, that these people who are very, very uninformed, they're painfully uneducated about the world. Most of them, a lot of them, I should say most, but a lot of them certainly are silver spoons. They go off to Harvard, Yale, Dartmouth, Brown, whatever, and these people would never be able to make it in the private sector. People like Ocasio-Crazy-Cortez. She's an idiot, and yet she sits up in Congress because the people in Queens are idiots. They're just less idiot than she is. All right, so if she's got an IQ of 105, 110, and they got an IQ of 80 because, that's where they're from, they think that she's smart, when in fact she's dumb as you can possibly be. The other thing is that it seems that the greatest majority of people are very passive, and they're very, very, well, they're not just risk averse, but they're conflict adverse. All right? I mean, I can see being risk averse, especially the older you get, because the longer it takes to recover from a financial disaster, well, if you're 60 years old, and how many years do you have to recover? All right? If you're in your 20s and 30s, you can roll those dice, and you can, if you fail, you've got time to recover. Now, I can understand that. But if you've got somebody who's telling you to act or behave or believe in a certain way that's contrary to rational thought, and more importantly, facts and evidence, and you refuse to say or protest or otherwise, then, well, frankly, you're just a pussy, and it's disgusting. Other thing is that it appears that we lack basic pattern recognition, right? We simply, well, that's one of the reasons why I put up those IQ tests at the beginning, because like I said in another video, IQ is nothing more than the ability to be able to recognize patterns in context, and the greatest majority of people simply can't see patterns over and over and over again. We lack an awareness of history. Remember the quote? This is, if we forget our history, we're doomed to repeat it. And that's exactly what we're doing. We're letting the libtard Dems, these woke-tard, retard, libtard Dems, the radical progressives, rewrite our history. And that's exactly what you do when you go into it. You want to supplant a culture. Well, one of the first things you do is you get rid of their language. You can go in and you supplant their language. But then you can go into their textbooks. You rewrite their history. This is what the Nazis did. You sit down and you limit what the children are able to read, and then you get an entire generation full of idiots who don't know anything about the world, and all they understand is the party line. So the other thing is that we lack a basic understanding of science. I mean, look at all these people who think the earth is only 4,000 years old. People who believe in absolute, it's absolute nonsense to believe in most of this stuff that is coming out of the woke-tard, libtard, transgenderism is a good example. Anybody who believes that a genetic male can become a female they've got mental illness, it's groupthink, it's virtue signaling, it's all of these symptoms of mass psychosis. All right, so let's go into some of the stuff with respect to censorship. I just pulled an article off the internet. It says, how did the Nazis use censorship? Well, it says, when the Nazis came to power in 1933, the German Constitution guaranteed freedom of speech and freedom of the press. Through decrees, which we would call executive orders, right, and laws, There are no laws against freedom of speech in this country, but there's sure an awful lot of executive orders and decrees out there. Starting in 1934, it was illegal. Oh, I'm sorry. Through the decrees and laws, the Nazis abolished these civil rights and destroyed German democracy. Starting in 1934, it was illegal to criticize the Nazi government. Yeah, if I criticize a patently absurd concept that's coming out of the World Health Organization or any other organization for that matter, says these policies are not based on any studies to be able to support their position. Yet the tech companies deem that they know better than everybody else and that it's their job to be censoring the truth. I mean, look at what they did with Hunter Biden. In the mainstream media, they say, oh, yeah, I'm on Hunter Biden's laptop. It's Russian disinformation. Well, how'd that work out for you? Because now we know, right? The 4 states of knowing. You don't know, you don't know. You know, you don't know. You know, and you know, but you can't explain it. Well, now we know that the Hunter Biden laptop story is not disinformation. It's real, and it's a nightmare, but the mainstream media completely ignores it. But more importantly, at first they said, well, we're going to censor this, and if we don't censor it, we're just going to call it Russian disinformation. When in fact, it isn't. It's not the proper place for the Twitter and Snapchat and Instagram, the rest of these social medias. They're the modern platforms. They're modern newspapers of the day. People don't put anything into print anymore. They go on video. They go on blogs, right? And it's not the proper place for government. And YouTube is government, by the way, and I'll be going into that in just a second. To be censoring, pornography and stuff like that. Yeah, okay, we can understand that because there are laws against that. Okay, disseminating pornography to minors and so on. But the spoken word, other than, once again, politically protected free speech, does not include threats of violence and insurrection, stuff like that. All right. Says even telling a joke about Hitler was considered treachery. People in Nazi Germany could not say or write whatever they wanted. All right? They could not say words. Now, these are examples of censorship under the Nazi regime. Closing down or taking over anti-Nazi newspapers. So they would just shut you down. If you had so much as a contrary thought to the party line, they'd just shut you down. Controlling what news appeared in the newspapers, right? So when YouTube or Snapchat or Instagram or any of these other groups censor people like myself or Styx Hexenhammer or Sanity for Sweden or all of these other people, Mercola and so on, what are they doing? They're controlling what news appears in the newspapers, on the radio, and in the news feeds, and that's it. It's just modern day censorship through the platforms that exist in a modern context. Banning and burning books that the Nazis categorized as un-German. Right? They were limiting the information that was being allowed to be put into print to the people, and controlling what soldiers wrote at home. Well, we did that too during World War II. We had you couldn't write just a letter to back home because you might be giving up positions. You could be giving up strategies that could be intercepted in the mails, and you certainly can't be doing that. But that's not what we're talking about. Now, and here we go. It says, in the textbooks are a good example of how propaganda and censorship works together in the Nazi regime. Like I said before, it says if you can get to the textbooks, teaching transgender nonsense and all this other, this patently absurd belief systems, equity, diversity, inclusion, the rest of this nonsense, then you have a generation of kids that grow up to believe this stupidity. All right? Okay, and then there's just one in here. In September of 1939, World War II begins on September 1st, 1939. Shortly afterwards, the Nazi regime makes listening to foreign radio broadcasts illegal. This is an attempt to control what information Germans hear about the war. The Nazi regime sees news and information from outside of Germany as a security threat. They are worried about foreign radio broadcasts which some Germans can access on their home radios. Later in the war, the regime even sentences people to death for listening to foreign radio stations. Right? Is this what we want in a free society? We want corporations, which are the equivalent to government and are, in this case, actually our government, telling people what they can and cannot think and what they can and cannot say and what they can and cannot read and observe on channels. This is nonsense. What the dum-dums at YouTube and Snapchat and Instagram fail to understand that sooner or later the winds change, and when we get these dum-dum Democrats out of here, and we take the House, we take the Senate, and we get a presidency in there that's a conservative presidency, these laws are going to change, all right? And what's going to happen is that there are going to be civil liabilities that Google, because it's Alphabet, and the rest of the Instagram and so on are going Facebook and so on, are going to have to pay. Right? They think that they're held harmless for their decisions when in fact they're not. All right, let me go into the Russian propaganda stuff and then we'll go into the law. All right, so this, I don't know what the date is on this, but it says Russian authorities are currently discussing blocking the Telegram messaging app. I don't even know what that is, but what is it? It's censorship. Okay, but the Bolsheviks seized power in Russia in 1917 while championing freedom. All right, the useless idiots, the liberals. All right, what they did is that they stormed the palace. They took out the czars and his family, shot them all. It was the Bolshevik revolution. Well, what was the first thing Stalin did was he killed all the useful idiots. If the Bolsheviks could take down the czar, they could take down him. You know, he understood that, so he just put them up all against the walls and got rid of them. He's not going to put up with that stuff. It says, yet one of their first decisions was to limit free speech through harsh censorship. In early November 1917, the Soviet government signaled a decree on press which prohibited publishing any bourgeois articles criticizing the Bolsheviks' authority. So if you talk about the kind of nonsense that's gone on in the last 2 years, I'm criticizing government authority. And yet, what we have is we have the modern day platforms out there, we call it high tech, the high tech platforms out there actively, unabashedly censoring free speech under the guise that it's protecting the public. Well, it's not the proper place for YouTube or Snapchat and Facebook. It's to be protecting the public from information. It's for us to decide what it is that we want to see, what we want to hear, and what we want to say, right? But the people, you people, keep voting these retards into office, and this isn't going to change until you stop voting retards into office, all right? In 1921, the young Soviet government created the Glavlit, all right, the General Directorate for the Protection of the State Secrets of the Press. For decades remained the main instrument of controlling literature. And of course they book burned and they did everything else. So now you get the idea. You know what censorship is, and you know that it's a bad idea. All dictators agree gun restrictions, right, gun control, and censorship works. It allows them to be able to remain in power for long times. All right? So let me get into why, what YouTube and Facebook and Snapchat, for there's no such thing as a private corporation. I said this before in another video. Remember the case Hale versus Henkel? Well, Hale versus Henkel is 201 U.S. 43. It's a 1906 case. And it says, a corporation is a creature of the state. Right? And that it is. All corporations have corporate charters. They have a license from the state. And once again, like I said, you lose your liberty through contract. What happens is when you go to the government for a benefit, in this case bankruptcy protection, right, the ability to be able to sequester your assets from your corporate liabilities, you drive a benefit. And corporations are agents for government, and that includes Alphabet. Alphabet owns Google, Alphabet owns YouTube, Alphabet owns all kinds of companies. So and more importantly, they're publicly traded under 1933, 1934 Securities Acts. They're even more strictly controlled as to what they can and cannot do, inconsistent with their corporate charters. It says franchises of corporations chartered by a state are, so far as they involve questions of interstate commerce, and clearly YouTube and Facebook and everybody on the internet involves interstate commerce, exercised in subordination to the power of Congress to regulate such commerce, and while Congress may not have general visitatorial power over state corporations, as Congress usually doesn't touch doesn't get involved at the state level with respect to how corporations manage, its powers in vindication of its own laws are the same as if the corporations had been created by an act of Congress. All right? And so when Congress or the government moves to be able to control a corporation's behavior, let's say you're DuPont, for example, and you're spewing forth filth into the East River in New York, well, it doesn't matter that you're a, quote, private corporation incorporated probably out of Delaware somewhere, like YouTube is. Alphabet is a Delaware corporation. They move in interstate commerce, they're violating federal law, and the federal government has jurisdiction over them. It's called long-arm jurisdiction. All right? In fact, these are some of my notes. YouTube it's a wholly owned subsidiary of Alphabet. It says they have registered agents in the state of Colorado. They do business in the state of Colorado. They have we have long-arm jurisdiction over them, and YouTube collects and pays taxes. right? Well, Google collects and pays taxes, but because it's all under an umbrella in their SEC filings and their 10Ks and 10Qs, YouTube is part and parcel to what Google does and Alphabet, and they're all one organization. So now let's go to the law and how it is that censorship in Colorado is unlawful for YouTube to be able to enforce their policies, even through the terms. You cannot, through, let's say, terms of service, you cannot be forced to waive your rights under law through contract. You can't even do it voluntarily. For example, in labor law, let's say you're an employer and you bring somebody in and you want them to waive a workman's compensation by contract. Right? Say, hey, well, I'll bring you. You can work for me, but you can't. But I can't afford the workman's compensation. But if you can waive this by contract, then I'll be able to hire you. Well, you can't do that. Right? You can't waive rights under law through contract, and that's what they're trying to do with terms of service. They say, well, you have to follow these terms of service with respect to content, and in essence, they're saying, well, you don't have any First Amendment rights, much like if you join the military. Right? When you join the military, you're subject to the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Right? Civilian isn't required to follow the UCMJ, and you have effectively waived First Amendment rights with respect to an enormous number of matters, because you can't be partisan or biased when you're in the military. At least you're not supposed to be. Right? So Colorado Revised Statutes 24-34-601. Anybody watching this, you might, especially if it's YouTube watching this, or any other high tech, you might want to read that statute. It says, as used in this Part 6, place of public accommodation means any place of business engaged in any sales to the public, right? And YouTube sells their service to the public, right? You can use $15 a month, so you can have ad-free YouTube, right? So at $15, there you go. You're a place of public accommodation, even though it's being spread out over the internet. It says, including but not limited to any business offering wholesale or retail sales to the public. Part 2A says, it is a discriminatory practice and unlawful, which, by the way, in Colorado gives you a private right of action, and an attorney would know what that means. It means I can sue you as an individual. Okay? It says under 2A, it is a discriminatory practice and unlawful for a person directly or indirectly to refuse, withhold from, or deny to an individual or group because of disability or creed the full and equal enjoyment of the goods, services, facilities, privileges, advantages, or accommodations of a place of public accommodation. Right? And my creed is, creed is defined. Creed is defined at 3 CCR, those are the Colorado rules, 708-1, Rule 50.1. Defines creed as, creed and religion are defined as a religious, moral, or ethical belief which is sincerely held and includes all aspects of religious observance and practice. Right? And it's my firmly held religious belief for me to speak out against authoritarian rule and factual inconsistency. Policies that are inconsistent with science are nonsense, they're balderdash, and they should be, you need to be able to protest against authoritarian rule. Let's see. Then it goes on to, this is a notice and demand I did against Sprouts for their idiocy. And then this goes on further. The ability of government, and I'm going into that, government consonant with the Constitution to shut off discourse solely to protect others from hearing it, depending upon a showing that substantial privacy interests are being invaded in an essentially intolerable manner. Any broader view of this authority would effectively empower a majority to silent dissents simply as a matter of personal predilections. And that's the case called Cohen versus California at 403 U.S. 15 at page 21. There's also what's called Erznosnik versus City of Jacksonville, 422 U.S. 205. Right? So what that's saying is that government cannot do it. You say, well, these are private corporations. Like I said, all corporations are creatures of government, and more importantly, Alphabet, Google, YouTube, all take federal and state monies. All of those corporations have contracts. You don't think YouTube doesn't have a contract with the state of California and New York and Florida and Texas and every other state? Of course they do. And they have registered agents in those individuals for the purpose of service of process. So if you have, for some magical reason, you need to sue somebody, It's usually a place called like the corporation company. It's going to be a company that you look up the Secretary of State in an individual state. You look up Secretary of State and you look up the registered agent, for Alphabet Corporation, and it's going to say probably the corporation company. I haven't looked it up, but that's usually the case. And there's no such thing as a private corporation. They don't exist. All corporations are creatures of government, and they're subject to the whims, sadly, of dum-dums writing policy, rules and regulations, which is why corporations have to follow rules and regs. People, once again, don't have to follow rules and regs unless there's what? A contractual nexus to the state of the form. If you don't have a contract, then the only thing you have to follow is law. Anything that's actually been enacted into law, which is statutes or ordinances. That's it. Rules, regulations, resolutions, the rest of this stuff, those are contractual adhesion clauses. So you've got a contract somewhere along the way with government if you have to follow a rule or regulation or resolution. All right. So some of this I've said before, but censorship is a very bad idea in any form, other than anything. If it's not politically protected free speech, no threats. You can't have that, and you can't have a call to arms for insurrection. You can't have any of that kind of nonsense. But everything else is fair game, and frankly, violation of it ultimately will be actionable in the federal courts, and the tech companies will lose, and they'll lose big with a lot of punitive damages, exemplary and punitive damages. So there we go. Thanks for the time.